Today we're going to be talking about the CF-104 Starfighter, the missile with a man in it, otherwise known as the plane that goes at Mach Jesus and you get to lose a drag race immediately after it. But before we begin, we must ask ourselves the question, what is Starfighter? Who is Starfighter? And why is Starfighter? To answer all of these questions, let's begin with looking at the Canadian version that the Canadian Museum of Flight currently has, the CF-104. The CF-104 was basically an F-104 Starfighter. I know the differences are there. But it began eating poutine and growing an unhealthy love for hockey and free healthcare. One of the ways we're still better than the States. Though the CF-104 was retired in 1987, it still remains the fastest aircraft ever to serve within the RCAF. But before that, let's look a little bit at its American brethren. So the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter is an American single-engine supersonic interceptor. An interceptor is basically an aircraft that takes off from the nearest airfield and intercepts anything that is dumb enough to intrude on its airspace. It was one of the Century series of fighter aircraft for the United States Air Force, and it was developed into an all-weather multi-role aircraft in the early 1960s and extensively deployed as a fighter-bomber during the Cold War. Fighter-bomber means you fight other aircraft, but guess what? If there's stuff on the ground, you get to take that shit out as well. After interviews with Korean War fighter pilots in 1951, Lockheed lead designer Kelly Johnson chose to buck the trend of the ever larger and more complex fighters to produce a simple, lightweight aircraft with maximum altitude and climb performance. This would result in the XF-104 on the 4th of March 1954, when this experimental model took to the skies for the first time. Just a few months later, it was pressed into action during the Second Taiwan Strait crisis to deter the use of MiG-15 and MiG-17 engines. Although problems with the General Electric J-79 engine and a preference for fighters with longer ranges limited its service with the United States Air Force. Though it was reactivated for service during the Berlin crisis of 1961 and the Vietnam War, when it flew more than 5,000 combat sorties. 15 NATO and Allied air forces would eventually fly the Starfighter, many for much longer than the United States Air Force. The most famous of these was, of course, Canada, but also West Germany, who selected the Starfighter to be their main frontline interceptor in 1958. Unfortunately, in this service, it would gain a reputation for being quite unsafe thanks to its high landing speeds, and the fact that many German pilots were simply not used to the Starfighter's controls. The Germans lost 292 of 916 aircraft and 116 pilots from 1961 to 1989. Its high accident rate and earning it the nickname Witwenmacher, or Widowmaker from the German public. The final production version, the F-104S, was an all-weather interceptor built by Alitalia for the Italian Air Force, and it was only retired from military service in 2004. As of 2025, several F-104s remain in civilian operation with Florida-based Starfighters Incorporated. But enough about the world, we're here to talk about the Great White Frozen North. So what is the CF-104? Well, the CF-104 is basically a Canadianized F-104. And as stated before, the F-104 was designed to go at the speed of Mach Jesus in a straight line, intercept and quickly down anything dumb enough to enter its airspace, and then if anything did in fact survive, they get to lose a drag race immediately after as the Starfighters hightailed out of there. The Canadair CF-104 is a modified version of the F-104 Starfighter aircraft built in Canada by Canadair. It was built under license. Primarily used as, interestingly enough, a ground attack aircraft, despite it being designed as a fighter. It served with the Royal Canadian Air Force and later the Canadian Armed Forces until it was replaced in 1987, as Dad said before. So in the late 1950s, Canada redefined its role in NATO with a commitment to a nuclear strike mission. At the same time, Canada began to consider replacement for the F-86 Sabres that had been utilized as a NATO day fighter. So, the government went shopping. They considered the Blackburn Buccaneer, the Dassault Mirage, Fiat G91, the Grumman Super Tiger, the F-104, the Northrop N-156, and the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief, which I believe was called the Thud. Though the RCAF had preferred the Thud over equipped with an Avro Canada-Orenda Iroquois engine, eventually the choice for a strike reconnaissance aircraft revolved around cost as well as capability. So, they went with the CF-104. In addition, Canadair was contracted to make multiple aircraft, wing sets and tail assemblies, and rear fuselage sections for 66 Lockheed-built F-104Gs destined for the German Air Force. The Canadian Museum of Flight CF-104 is a two-seater variant. It was one of 22 built for the Royal Canadian Air Force, though other single-seater variants would also eventually be delivered. This specific CF-104 was used as a movie prop in the film Night at the Museum 2, and a handful of the museum's volunteers actually flew this exact Starfighter while serving in the RCAF: Al French, George Miller, and George Kirbyson. The CMF acquired this CF-104 Starfighter from the Comox Air Force Museum in a trade for a Piasecki H-21, otherwise known as the Flying Banana. The Comox AFB Museum of Flight had two H-21 helicopters, but at the time the Canadian Museum of Flight had two H-21 helicopters, so the trade was made. The CMF Starfighter unfortunately does not have an engine currently, but it does have an afterburner supplied from SNS turbines. The CF-104 would cut its teeth in Canadian service beginning in March 1962, but it was actually used primarily for low-level strike and reconnaissance by the Royal Canadian Air Force. 8 CF-104 squadrons were originally stationed in Europe as part of Canada's NATO commitment. When the CAF later discontinued the strike reconnaissance role for conventional attacks, the M61A1 was refitted, and the CF-104 would go on to carry Mark 82 Snake-Eye iron bombs, British BL-755 cluster bombs, and Canadian-designed CRV-7 rocket pods. Although Canadian pilots did practice air combat tactics, or ACM, the AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles were unfortunately never carried operationally by Canadian starfighters. However, examples provided to other air forces such as Norway and Denmark did carry wing rails and centerline stations. In summary, the F-104, and by extension the CF-104, is a very fast, record-setting missile. Unfortunately, would also receive quite a bit of controversy surrounding its service record, but in Canadian service it proved to be reliable and quite safe. And I would argue one of the best aircraft ever to serve with the RCAF. Thank you for watching.